So, thinking about how Western medicine evolved, we started in Egypt, and this is just looking now at the Western track of medicine, taking away the rest of global civilization, because we didn't go out and discover those until relatively late in the day. So you started with Egyptian, which moved on into Greek and Roman, and we're going to see that went to Arabic and Dark Ages, Arabic in North Africa, Dark Ages in Europe, came together in the Middle Ages, moved through to the sort of Victorian era, where we began to develop the scientific method, and that moved us to modern medicine. And what we're going to do today is we're going to try and whiz through all of this up to the dawn of modern medicine. Okay? And to do that, we need to see how we moved from Egypt to Greece. There are huge spans of time involved here. In Egypt, they were doing medicinal chemistry 2500 BC. The Greek system started like 500 BC, so you're 2,000 years later on, right? But really, nothing had changed. So that's kind of weird concept for us. You imagine going to the year 4000 AD and nothing's changed about how we do medicine. Everything's the same. They've still got penicillin. They've still got just all the same drugs that we have. Is a strange concept to us. But pace of change was very different. And Hippocrates was the person who is most associated as the father of Greek medicine. You'll recognize the name. So, father of Greek medicine. You know the name because all medics here in the UK swear the Hippocratic Oath. And what he really did is he developed medical practice. And the basics, it seems a very obvious one, but do not harm was the basic medical practice. You don't harm your patient. And he is associated with one kind of drug discovery, although whether it was him who really discovered it or just popularized it, and that was the use of willow bark, which was active against pain. And many of you will know that leads to the story of aspirin, and we'll come back to that later in this lecture. But you chewed on the willow bark to deal with pain. There were a number of other Greeks. You come 500 years later on again, and you get to Dioscorides. This is a really beautiful illustrated manuscript of Dioscorides. This does not date from the Greek era. This is from the Middle Ages in the UK, where the manuscripts of Dioscorides were copied out and kept because this was still how diseases were being treated even in the Middle Ages in the UK, as we'll see. So Dioscorides was the absolute authority in herbal medicine for 1,500 years. He was to Western culture what Emperor Shen Nung was to Chinese culture. And essentially, he stole it all. So much of the knowledge was from the Ebers papyrus. The Greeks had the Ebers papyrus, they translated it into Greek, and they took the knowledge on, and you can just track it all back. So if you look at Dioscorides and you look at the Ebers papyrus, you can see the same kinds of prescriptions for the same kinds of things. But Dioscorides is the one that you'd look back to. And Galen then was probably the most famous doctor of the Greek era, and importantly, he developed ideas of anatomy. Most famously, things like arteries and veins. And this becomes important when we get to lecture 5. If we're really going to understand how drugs work inside you, then Galen's understanding and the development of a proper understanding of human anatomy, and then to put on top of that the chemistry later on, is really essential. So, then the Roman Empire just did the same stuff that the Greeks were doing, really. And then the Roman Empire fell and the Dark Ages came into Europe, and that meant medicine really stopped evolving in Western Europe completely. There was more superstition in medical practice, there was more spirituality and demonology. The religious people became the centres of medicine. So you go to places like Fountains Abbey, out in the countryside in Yorkshire, where the monks were. This was the centre of healing. If you were sick in York, back in 1200 AD, you'd go and find your nearest monastery and you'd ask the monks to try and heal your condition. And they'd use the herbal methods that they'd remembered through copying the manuscripts from the time of Dioscorides. And really outside the educated centres of religion, most medicine was just folklore and was passed on as an oral tradition in that era. The Arab world was in a very different place. The Arab world in 700 to 1300 AD was really probably the centre of global development. And so there were lots of things being done in the Arab world. And lots of things were written about medicine and health and disease and pharmacy. And probably the most famous ones are the formulary of Al-Kindi and Al-Samarkandi. But they're really, if you're honest, they're updated versions of Dioscorides. They have a few new things added in, but they're herbalism updated by Arabic culture. There were not, in the field of medicine, there were many other areas where the Arab world did, in astronomy and mathematics, develop wholly new concepts. But in medicine, they essentially continued with herbalism. There weren't sort of new major fundamental principles being introduced during that period. And that brings us to the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages was when things began to get a little bit more interesting from a chemistry point of view. And that's primarily because of the rise of alchemy. So as you'll probably know, during the Middle Ages, alchemists emerged and their primary mission was to turn everything into gold so that they could become rich. Of course, that's not possible. But in the process of doing alchemy, they did realise that you could take one substance and turn it into another. And that became the foundation of modern chemistry. And because they really wanted a recipe for gold, they wrote down a lot of what they did. And so it began to codify the early period of chemistry. And it began to change the viewpoint, I suppose. Up until that era, people had assumed that all that you had was what was available in the world around you. You would harvest animals, you would harvest plants, and you would make use of that, and that was your limit. And it was in that era, because of the rise of alchemy, people began to say, we could make new things. We could actually transmute these substances into something completely new. We could synthesize something with a new purpose. And it was that change in mindset that really led to the beginning of medicinal chemistry. So if you want to move beyond herbalism and into medicinal chemistry, the founder of medicinal chemistry, without doubt, was Paracelsus. Paracelsus was a Swiss doctor and alchemist. And most importantly, he believed that the cures to disease lay in chemical substances. And as a chemist, that makes me very excited. He was the first one to really realise that. In this era, nobody really realised that plants and animals were full of chemical substances. Nobody had really made that connection almost. So sort of understanding that there was this synthetic thing that perhaps is in the natural world, but you can change as well, was really the new step. And as well as that, he was a good doctor because he advocated simple prescriptions and proof of efficacy. He wanted proof that the things he was prescribing worked. In that era, because herbalism, it works a bit, and it works for some things quite well, but on other things it doesn't really work very well at all. And what the herbalists would do is they say, oh, well, you need a little bit of this adding in, and you need a little bit of that adding in, and then the patient would still be getting sicker, so they'd add a little bit of this in and the patient would be taking a cocktail of 20 or 30 herbs, and the doctor would be saying, wow, we've got to do that. And Paracelsus said, no, it's got to be simple, and we need proof that it works. We're not just taking money off patients for a little bit of this and a little bit of that when we have no evidence that it works. So that was a good start. He believed that diseases were poisons, which is not a bad idea if you think about what we now know about sort of bacteria and what they do to your body. You can think of it as like a poison. He believed they were brought from the stars. He didn't get everything completely right. So they were like this. So there's still this link to spirituality. These diseases came from space. They sort of, because God, of course, couldn't have created a world that would have diseases on it in that era, because God wouldn't do that, right? Anyway. And interestingly, what he believed, which seems a little bit mad, but never mind, he believed that because diseases were poisons, he believed other poisons could treat them. So his favourite prescriptions to give people were things like mercury, arsenic, and antimony. So I've kind of set him up as the father of medicinal chemistry. His favourite treatments were all treatments that will kill you, right? But we'll come back to this idea about treating poisons with poisons, because it's not totally mad, right? If you think about even loosely what you know about treating cancer, very often you use quite a strong drug to treat cancer. It's not very pleasant for your body, but you're trying to kill off the cancer cells more than you damage your body. And this idea of using something kind of harmful to treat a disease hasn't gone away from modern medicine at all. That still sort of exists to a point. And so we'll come back to that a bit later on. So he started off thinking that chemistry was the solution, but chemistry didn't really develop because the alchemists realized that they couldn't make gold, and so people stopped giving them money to do stuff. And for the sort of 1600s and 1700s, and there was less money going into alchemy. And by the 18th century, medicine was operating on kind of anything goes. So you'd give people herbs and minerals, you'd bleed them, you'd blister them, you'd use leeches, you'd put them in spas, you'd go for sea bathing or electrotherapy. And all these things were done, and it seems a bit odd to us, like some of them seem really odd, but actually quite a lot of these things seem to work. And some of them for good reasons. If somebody has breathing problems and you send them to somewhere where the air is not full of smoke and is clearer, then they'll breathe better. And some of them work because of the placebo effect. Because as long as you think something is being done, there's an extent to which you can feel better. So it's worth defining the placebo effects. It's really important in the history of medicinal chemistry. And it is that an inert treatment, in modern era, that would be a salt tablet, but really anything can be a placebo, appears to work. And the patients respond. And it depends on the illness, right? So painkillers. Right? If you give someone a salt tablet, what percentage of people do you reckon report less pain with a salt tablet? Go on, have a guess. Somebody shout a figure out. 40%. Bang on. 40% of patients will respond to placebo and say, oh, that's great, my headache's gone away now. And you've given them nothing, right? Of course, a headache is well, I'm not saying it's psychological because it's wrong to say it's psychological, but clearly it's the kind of thing that maybe stress has an impact upon. And if you feel less stressed because you feel that you've been treated, maybe that has an impact on your headache. Maybe that lowers your blood pressure a bit. It changes some of the pathways and so on. So there are potentially physical ways that that can happen. Viagra. Once again, has a 40% placebo effect. 40% of people report better sex with a salt tablet than without a salt tablet. And in fact, the drug works on 75%. So you always compare treatment to placebo. And that's what wasn't being done in the 18th century. They'd bleed somebody or they'd send them to the seaside, and nearly half the patients might come back and say, oh, I feel a bit better. Obviously, it depends on the disease. And so they go, oh, that works then. The mechanism of the placebo effect is very interesting. Could spend like lectures talking about it. And it demonstrates that the interface between psychology and physiology is really poorly understood. The doctor-patient relationship is massively important in the placebo effect. There's a really interesting study that shows if you go to a standard doctor, you get a 10-minute consultation. If you go to a homeopathic doctor, you get a 30-minute consultation. And if you go for a 30-minute consultation with a normal doctor, you get the same kinds of outcomes with no treatment at all, with a salt tablet, as what you get with a 30-minute treatment. Just how long you talk to a healthcare professional has an impact on how much better you feel. But of course it differs from disease to disease. Placebo effects are very small in things like cancer, and they're very small in major bacterial infections. But they're very big in things like pain and chronic fatigue. So it depends on the condition.